My name is Maya, and this is my TriTime presentation. Imagine this. You're standing in line in IKEA. You're waiting for your mom to buy her stuff when your eye suddenly catches a big, heaping pile of stuffed animal bats. So of course, you being 5, you want a stuffed animal bat. This was the situation I was in when I wrote, as far as I can recall, my very first poem. Me and Frida were 2 very different people at the time of me being 5. Now, relating back to my poem story, Frida and I had, in reality, few things in common. One thing we had in common was that we both really loved to write, but for me, I wrote poems that I wanted to share with other people. Poems and stories were a way for me to express my feelings without saying it in words. Can't say it to the face? Write it on a piece of paper. I always wrote for other people to get my work appreciated. This was the one thing that Frida and I did not have in common. Frida always wrote, but when she did, she crumpled up the paper and put it in her drawer. She was often ashamed of what she did. She didn't really want other people to read her books and stories. This was one thing that came in mind to me when Mr. Buxton said that we were having TriTime. Now, what is TriTime, you might ask? TriTime is a time period over 3 weeks that we get to invest into our passions and developing them. As I mentioned before, I have a big passion for writing, and so I decided to spend my 3 weeks writing a book. On the very first day of TriTime, Mr. Buxton told us we had to find a driving question that we'd answer at the end of the unit. Some of the driving questions I thought of was to find a way that I could write poetry to help my parents understand me better, aka expressing my feelings as I mentioned before. Here's my first driving question. How can I best write a poetic journal to improve communication with my parents? See, the problem with this driving question was that it was quite hard to research, and so I wanted to find something that was more specific to my life, that may or may not be easier to research. The next thing I came up with was, what is the best way I, as a growing teen, can improve my communication with misunderstanding parents in a poetic journal form? Now, with this driving question, I attempted to make it more specific because I wanted it to really apply to my life. One thing Mr. Buxton says was that your TriTime experience doesn't necessarily have to change the world around you, as long as it changes your world. And that's what I had in mind when I thought of this driving question. But then again, this driving question was still far too hard to research, and also it wasn't really what I wanted. In reality, all I wanted to do was write, and this was a bit too specific to meet my needs. How can I motivate my parents to speak to me in a nice way through making them understand my communication reasoning through poetic journals? This DQ is my third DQ. In this DQ, or driving question, I was trying to have a more positive focus or drive on my DQ, because I wanted to communicate me reaching something, like aka in this situation, having my parents speak to me in a nice way. Still, this DQ was far too hard to research, and so I had to develop it further. How do parents positively react to a journal from their child? This was my fourth DQ, and this one was based off of some feedback I got from our sub in our class, Miss Levine. She is educated as a teacher, and so I thought she'd be a great person to ask for advice. She said, "Maya, what do you want to do?" And so I told her, well, I just want my parents to understand me, and I want to find a way where I'm fulfilling my passion and making my life better through making my parents understand me better. "All right," she said. "Well, what do you want to do?" I said, "I thought I could write a journal to them." "All right, good idea," she said. "Put it down on paper." And so I did. But as time went forward and I started to try to research this DQ, I found once again that it was quite hard to find articles online about children writing journals to their parents. And so, once again, I had to develop my DQ further. On the 5th day, I raised my hand and asked Mr. Livingstone for advice on my DQ. He said, "What do you want to do, Maya?" Once again, just like Miss Levine. I said, "I just want to write, I just want to write." "Put it on paper," he said, just like Miss Levine. And so I thought about it for a while, and I decided, really, I don't want to write a journal. I just want to write. I want to find a way that I can change my world through my passion. And so I wrote, "How can I, as a middle schooler, best write meaningful poetry?" And in the end, I still found that this DQ was far too hard to research because there's no statistics on meaningful poetry now, is there? You're not about to go up on the internet and Google how to write meaningful poetry. It's not going to help you write a book. It's not going to make people take your book off the shelf and take the time to read it just because you went on Google and looked for the best way to write meaningful poetry. And so I wanted to develop it further. I thought back, what was it I really wanted to do? At the very start of the unit, what was my approach to the unit? And so I remembered the poem I wrote when I was 5 about the toy bat. It came to mind to me that really what I wanted to do was to write for other people. And in this situation, it could be the 7th graders around me or my parents for that sake. And so my current DQ ended up being, how do I write a book written in verse that a teen audience wants to read? Now, I like this DQ, especially because Mr. Buxton gave me some advice on it. He once again, just like all the other teachers, said, "Maya, what do you want?" And this time I finally put the thought into it and said, I just want to write poems, and I want to write it for other people. And so I finally came up with this DQ. And now it was time to research. So I asked myself, what do I need to learn? I raised my hand for Mr. Buxton, and he came over and said, Maya, to answer your question, you want to find what people want, because what you're doing is writing for other people, aren't you? And so I said, all right, I'm going to have to do some research on what teens want to read and what the characteristics are of the books that teens and young adults read. And so I came up with 2 sub-questions that I could base my research on. What does a 7th grade audience want to read? And what are the characteristics of successful authors? Those were the questions I kept in mind when I did my research during the TriTime unit. Also, another thing I wrote down during the first week of TriTime was the things I wanted my project to have. You can see it here, you can read the list. Does your project have this? History? Why did I choose it? Is it simple? Is it complex? Does it have contents? Give a backstory. What was the challenge? Share the things that Mr. Buxton told you. Share your DQ. Share productivity. Defend your time. And share how it affects you. And share unintentional learning. I wanted to include this on my presentation because I wanted to show you all the thoughts that went into creating this project and this presentation. So, I ended up doing some corresponding research relating back to what I just did, spoke of. This was some things that Mr. Buxton told me to think about once I started my research. Who is my audience? What do they like? How can I advertise? And what are the most successful teen books? Now, I listened to Mr. Buxton because I know he has a good education and he's a great RLA teacher, and so I thought he'd be a good source to ask for advice on my writing. So, a few days later, Mr. Buxton mentioned that we could start doing interviews or send out emails. Of course, me having a tight schedule, I did not end up doing any interviews, but I ended up sending quite a few emails out to people. One of the people I sent an email to was Mr. Smith. He's the RLA teacher on B-side. As I mentioned before, because he's an RLA teacher, I think that he would be a great source to ask for advice on the books he hands his students. Now, I asked him questions like, what are some top reads in your class? And what are some of the books that the kids in your class are always trying to get their fingers on? He answered that a lot of the books that his kids were liking were things that were realistic fiction, but also written in an age group that were relatable to the audience. Now, I kept this in mind, which I'll speak of later, how I applied that knowledge to the poems I wrote. I also later decided to write an email to Davis because I figured out that he also had a passion for writing. I thought he'd be a good person to ask because he was also in my grade level, and so he'd be able to give me some advice on what he liked to write and read. I also wrote an email to Miss Christensen. Now, Miss Christensen is a teacher in 4th grade. She is, in fact, also my mom, but I thought she'd be a good idea to write to because I thought it'd be interesting to see what her students liked. Now, even though she was a teacher in 4th grade and she has a great education, I still wanted to know what younger kids liked because I'd like to put it into comparison of what 7th graders liked. Some of the stuff she told me was that little kids actually really enjoyed a series called Warriors. This is a book about cats, and so I kept this in mind even though it wasn't so much a 7th grade genre. I wanted to remember that even no matter what age group you're in, it's always interesting to see things from a different point of view, for example, when you're writing. So all this I wrote down. Alright, so next I wanted to say, what are some of the popular books that teens read? I wanted to look through these books and see what they had in common with my poetry, or how I could make my poetry have stuff in common with them. So I went onto Goodreads and I found a page that showed all the top 10 reads on all the top 10 books that have been read on Goodreads. I was only able to take a screenshot of 7 of them, but there were a few more. I wanted to keep this list of books in mind because, as I mentioned before, I wanted to apply it to my writing. So number 1 was To Kill a Mockingbird. Number 2 was 1984. Number 3 was Lord of the Rings. Number 4, The Great Gatsby. Number 5, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Number 6, Animal Farm. And number 7, The Diary of a Young Girl. Now, one thing I noticed that, for example, the book The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter had in common was relating back to my mom speaking of her 4th grade students' top reads, was that both of them have they have fantasy in them. They have things that aren't very likely to happen. And I thought this was interesting because based on what Mr. Smith told me, his students actually liked books that were more realistic. And so this relates down to The Diary of a Young Girl, which I thought was interesting. It's about someone named Anne Frank during the Second World War. I thought this was a really good book to keep in mind because, first of all, she's within our age group and she's writing from her perspective. It's a raw and realistic book. And this was 2 things that The Lord of the Rings and A Diary of a Young Girl didn't have in common. So I was a little perplexed at this time. I didn't quite know how to apply this to my poetry, and so I decided in my book that I'd have a nice combination of both. Next, I decided to move on. I went to a website on one of my leads that included the top 10 most read or most noteworthy poems. One of them was To Know Thirst by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now, these 2 poems, this one is called Dreams by Langston Hughes. One thing I found that these 2 poems had was that they both used simile, metaphor. They used a lot of figurative language. None of these poems actually were saying things straightforward. They weren't saying I was sad. They were saying, and after many a summer dies the swan. Now, this isn't exactly a line that makes sense, but it expresses feelings, and I thought this was also another important thing that I wanted to apply to my poetry. And so I decided to take this and write a new poem using the new methods I'd found. Now, this was an old poem I wrote before I started TriTime called Homework. Homework. Write less, eat an apple, play some chess, sandbox, bird flocks, build a fort, knit some socks, sit for dinner, don't you whine, holy smokes, it's homework time. So this is an okay poem. It's a little silly, it's not really meant to be taken seriously, and in reality, I don't think a lot of people were going to read this and be impressed and want to read more. And so I decided to use some of the things that I saw in the top 10 poems on my previous slide. Things like like a hidden meaning, you know what I mean? Symbolism. And so this is one I wrote called Cherry Trees, Nooks, and Crannies. Somehow, my bum fits, a little more comfortable each time. Cherry trees, nooks, and crannies. And now in this one, I tried to use few words because during our poetry unit, which was a bit later, Mr. Buxton said if every single word cost $100, you'd be broke by now. And so the less words you have in poetry, the more meaningful it is. And so I also applied this to writing this poem. Now in this poem, you'll find that, of course, it's realistic that someone speaks about climbing a cherry tree, but in reality, this poem is supposed to symbolize the idea of lying. The more you do it, you start to not know what the truth is anymore. And so I worked this into my poem. The more you do it, the more comfortable you become with it, and the harder time you have deciphering what's right and what's wrong. Now here was some more poems I wrote based on what I had, based on some of the feedback I'd gotten and some of the research I'd done on the other poems. Here's a poem about working. I wrote this during an RLA class. I really wanted to include this poem because this one, I wasn't really using any of the methods, but this was kind of expressing my feelings. At that time, I was very distressed because I was having a hard time finding research websites, and so I wrote this poem about working. I had to eat my work in tiny little pieces. I'd stab it with a fork and poke it with my knife. I'd stare at it on the plate, groaning, because it wouldn't stop tasting like squishy lima beans. You'll get big and strong if you eat your veggies. Well, I don't think RLA is edible. As I mentioned before, I wanted to include this poem because it was relating back to, once again, me writing about my feelings at the current time. I think often for me when I write poetry, it's not so much about the methods, it's more about getting an idea across. But I soon learned to change that as I moved on with some of the methods I'd learned from other poems. Now this is Lost My Hat again. Because I know, if I fling my Sunday hat hard enough, I'd have at least an hour getting lost in the bloody petals of silk, trying to find a twisty circle of wheat in the abundance of a giant maroon wall of joy. Now this one was also a little bit of symbolism. I think this one kind of was comparing procrastination. I wouldn't say it's a metaphor, but it was like saying that if you convince yourself enough that you have the time, eventually you'll give it to yourself. You'll give yourself that extra hour you need to finish your movie, for an example. And then you'll start working shorter and shorter and shorter and get less work. Anyway, this poem was using some of the symbolism that I spoke of in the Dreams poem by Langston Hughes. So this one was, this one called Pretty was, I believe, was going to be the start of a sonnet, which was one of the things that Mr. Buxton also spoke to us about. Now, a sonnet is a 14-line poem. It has, it usually, speaking of what Mr. Buxton told us, it has the volta at line 9. Anyway, let me read it for you. Pretty, but her eyes shine bright, robbing the midnight stars of their light. Her teeth all straight and white, flashing, blinking as she closes them tight. Now here's one called Counting by Twos. This one was using rhyme scheme, which was another thing I didn't speak of on the poems. It's, now one thing I noticed about a lot of these poems was that they actually didn't have a lot of rhyme scheme. Like, I think for me, rhyming kind of brings on more of a lighter, more silly, sometimes funnier twist on the poem, and so I wanted to write meaningful poetry, something that people were going to read and leave them with a feeling. But this one I wanted to give more of a lighter feel to it, so I used rhyme scheme. And this one I think it's ABCB, 7, 3, petals, trees. So 3 and trees rhymes because that's how the rhyme scheme works. Anyway, I'm not going to read this to you because it's quite long. I'll just read you the very first stanza. Counting by twos. Count by sevens, count by threes, count the petals, count the trees, count the days till spring will come, count the visits to and from, count the aunties knitting sweaters, count the children writing letters, count the whiteboards, count the pens, count the roosters, count the hens, count the foxes' furry chicks, count the burrows, count the sticks, count the posters on the wall, count the mean girls in the hall. And so that's just the first stanza of this poem. Anyway, I used rhyme scheme in that. And these are all poems that I'm going to speak of later. So as the days went by, I started noticing that during my first and second days, I was really struggling with distraction. I guess I told myself, because I was having a hard time, I cut myself some slack. I said, oh, I'll figure it out later. You don't need to figure it out right now because, you know, understanding stuff takes time. And I think one thing that I definitely wanted to work on for the future projects is if there's something I don't understand, it's better to ask and ask and ask, be a pest and ask all the time, as long as you get the answer to your question, and so that you can move on more effectively. And this moves on to another one of the challenges I had. So after the first week, I had my DQ, I had some good leads, and I started doing some research. But I found myself often asking myself, like, why am I researching? What am I trying to do? Where's this all going? And so I raised my hand and I told Mr. Buxton that I was struggling. Not because I didn't have the stuff to do it, just because mentally I was just having a hard time understanding the purpose. And that was one of the things I learned about myself, which I'll speak of later, was that if I misunderstand something, I often need to ask for help and have a goal to move on. Now, some of the regrets I had, as I spoke of before, I was often having distraction because I was cutting myself slack, I was sitting by friends, and I was just goofing off, and I really needed to improve that. And so I definitely regret not moving from my friends, because later in the TriTime experience, during the second week, I believe, I moved myself from my friends, and I just started working much better. The slides were coming fast, I was writing better poems, everything was just going better, and my research quality started to improve. Another thing I definitely regret was not asking for help. I remember after I moved from my friends and I started to try to think about how I could improve my work, I was convinced that I could do it all on my own, and I definitely regretted not raising my hand and asking Miss Levine, or Mr. Buxton, or Mr. Livingstone for advice on my project. And so, some of the challenges I did, here's some things that I did to overcome those challenges. So here's what I did about it. I asked everyone. I created a to-do list, and I created, oh, okay. Thank you. Do I have to stop it? I'm so good.